One of the most potent forces of the 19th and 20th centuries was nationalism. I plan on discussing nationalism by defining the term and then providing two examples which showcase the different ways that nationalism could affect the process of state building in the mid to late 19th century. The first example will be the unification of Germany, and the second example, the disunification or disintegration of Austria. Of course, in order to understand what nationalism means, we first need to define the term nation. Although that word is used loosely today in a number of ways, it does have a specific meaning. For our purposes, a nation will be defined as a group of people who share one or more of these four traits: language, history, customs, and culture. In other words, a group of people who speak the same language often consider themselves members of the same nation. Also, people who have a common culture might consider themselves to be co-nationalists. In general, the bonds of a nation are stronger the more of the traits the group has in common, while fewer ties, or none, loosen or terminate national feeling. According to these criteria, the United States is not a nation, because the people who live under the government of the United States do not share these common bonds. Clearly then, in order to share a government, you do not have to be members of a common nation. Although, as we shall see, these commonalities do help in forming tight bonds within a country. A nationalist, then, is someone who feels that all the members of a nation ought to be united under one government. In other words, national and political boundaries ought to be the same. Nationalists would argue that members of the Italian nation ought to have an Italian state, just as members of the French nation ought to have a French state. In the same way, nationalists might argue that members of a different nation within the current state boundaries ought to be excluded. One of the common such exclusions were the Jewish people, who were considered by most to be a separate nation, and therefore legitimately excluded from the rights within other nation-states. We will discuss the consequences of this in a later lecture. The origins of nationalism, as is so much the 19th century, can be found in the French Revolution. One of the actions of the revolutionaries was to declare themselves to be the French nation, as opposed to a group of people under the control of the French monarch. As such, they changed their national flag from the personal flag of the French monarchy, seen here on the left, to a French national flag, on the right. In this way, the government represented the interests of the French nation rather than the Bourbon family. The army now belonged to the nation, or to the French people, rather than to Louis or his family. Another consequence of the French Revolution was the growing nationalism amongst those non-French nations conquered by France. Many people in Germany and Italy resented being conquered, dominated, and controlled by the French. The French were seen as outsiders, which led many to consider who they were and how they defined themselves. In addition to being not French, many of these occupied people began to call themselves Germans or Italians, the first stirring of nationalist feeling in many of these places. The Congress of Vienna completely ignored nationalism, even working against it in some ways. The Congress did nothing to help the Germans and the Italians achieve national independence, and they even lumped nations together into composite states, such as when they combined the Dutch and the Belgians into one state. Remember that this union only lasted 15 years, until the successful revolt of 1830. Further, rather than legitimize the right of the French to see themselves as the French nation, the Congress of Vienna returned France to the Bourbon family as a private possession. Although they tried to turn the clock back to before the Revolution, the members of the Congress of Vienna didn't succeed in their aims. In some ways, they actually encouraged nationalism by dismissing such ideas so thoroughly and treating them so dismissively. In contemplating nationalism, I have found it helpful to think of it as making up two categories. There is disunification or disintegration nationalism, like we shall see in Austria. In these circumstances, a country was made up of a number of smaller nations. Most of these smaller nations resented being grouped together, and nationalists longed to break that nation apart into its component parts. Each of these would then become a separate nation. Thus, the larger country needed to disintegrate in order for nationalists to get what they wanted. The other category of nationalism is unification nationalism. In this scenario, a number of small states notice when they share national attributes with each other. Thus, they decide to merge together to form a larger state that altogether forms their nation. Thus, the smaller countries unify to form a true nation. The second scenario is what we'll see in Prussia. The king of Prussia, who would oversee the unification of Prussia and other states into Germany, was William I. Overall, he was not the most important figure in the unification process, but he was the monarch who began as the king of Prussia and died as the emperor of a unified Germany. The most significant fellow in the unification of Germany was the Chancellor, or Prime Minister of Prussia, a man named Otto von Bismarck. He would be the one who oversaw the political, diplomatic, and military process of unifying Germany. The theoretical basis of his actions became known as realpolitik, or realistic politics. Fundamentally, this means that states act for their own interests in a very practical way. Ethical considerations would take second place behind power politics. We will see rather dramatically the consequences of these actions. In order to follow the train of events that culminated in German unification, I want to start by providing a ridiculously simplified map of Central Europe in 1863. This area could be roughly divided into 4 regions or parts. The first part of Central Europe was the state of Prussia. Prussia is the light blue portion of this map. William I was the king of Prussia, and Bismarck was Prussia's chancellor. The characteristics of Prussia that are important for us to remember are as follows. First, it was a fragmented state. It did not connect with itself, and you needed to travel across foreign countries to visit the entire state. Secondly, it was located geographically in Northern Europe. Thirdly, Prussians spoke the German language. There were no significant minorities within Prussia that spoke any language other than German. Lastly, the prevailing religion within Prussia was Lutheran Protestantism. Remember that Luther began his Reformation in what would later become Germany. The second subsection of Central Europe were the North German states. Although there were a number of independent principalities here, I have lumped them together for our analysis. As you can tell from their name, they were located in the north, and they spoke German. Also, as you may have guessed, they were predominantly Protestant. As such, the North German states had the closest affinity to Prussia in many ways. Linguistically, geographically, and religiously, the two areas had much in common. The third section of Central Europe, and by far the largest, was Austria. As you can tell from the yellow area on the map, Austria was large and located in the southern region. The principal religion within Austria was Catholicism, which set it apart from the Germans living in the north. Perhaps the most significant division, however, is the fact that Austria contained within its borders a significant number of minority languages. German was the official language of the state, and was spoken in the capital of Vienna. Overall, though, there were more people within Austria that didn't speak German than did. There were at least 10 other languages commonly spoken within Austria. Thus, whereas German was a unifying factor in Prussia, it was a dividing factor in Austria. We will see what impact this had on Austrian history momentarily. The last group I wish to discuss here is the green area, which I've called the South German states. Again, like the North German states, this is actually a compilation of a number of independent states, but they had common traits and largely acted together, so I'm going to discuss them as one. As their name suggests, this area is characterized by being located in the southern regions, and the people spoke German and considered themselves Germans. The prevailing religion in these areas was Catholicism. Thus, they tended to look to Austria for support and assistance when needed. Bismarck's unification plan was brutally simple and ultimately effective. He knew that Austria was too large, strong, and diverse to ever be merged into a truly German state, so his plan was to exclude Austria from Germany. Instead, Bismarck aimed to unite Prussia with the North and South German states I've just described. To accomplish this, Bismarck outlined his ideas in what became known as his Iron and Blood speech. It was quickly clear that Bismarck planned to use military force to accomplish the unification of Germany. In the end, it took him 3 wars, each of which began and ended on Bismarck's terms, to get what he wanted, a unified Germany. The first of Bismarck's wars began with a controversy in southern Denmark. Denmark controlled the southern provinces of Schleswig and Holstein, even though Germans lived in these provinces, and they spoke German, not Danish. Bismarck manufactured a crisis by demanding that these provinces be granted their autonomy. This is patently absurd. How is a kingdom to respond when a foreign power demands that they grant autonomy to people within their borders? In any event, the crisis led to the Danish War, in which Bismarck convinced the Austrians to join forces with him to crush Denmark and force the Danes to hand Schleswig and Holstein over to Germans. Schleswig was to be added to Prussia, while Holstein would be administered by Austria. This was difficult geographically, since Holstein was in northern Europe and Austria in southern. In order to travel to Holstein, Austrians needed to travel through a number of the North German states. Bismarck worked with the North German states to put a number of tolls and other difficulties in the way of the Austrians who attempted to administer their new possession. In the end, Austria and Prussia became embroiled in a conflict over Holstein that led to war. This war is known both as the Austro-Prussian War and the 7 Weeks' War. As you can tell from the name, it was a short, decisive war. Prussia and her allies in the north crushed Austria and her allies in the south. Despite the crushing defeat, Austria didn't lose a significant amount of territory apart from Holstein. There were a number of other concessions, though, that Austria did need to make. First, Prussia and the 5 northern German states merged together under the government of the King of Prussia. This map demonstrates the new territorial situation. As you can tell, the blue state, Prussia, has expanded to absorb Schleswig, Holstein, and the North German states. Also significant for our purposes, Austria was forced to cut its political and military ties with the South German states. These states had always looked to Austria for guidance and protection. If they got into trouble now, they were specifically banned from asking Austria for protection, or else risk another war with Prussia. Who would protect them now? It seems reasonably clear that Bismarck had looked forward to just this situation, and it is his desire that the South German states look to Prussia in the future instead of Austria. After all, both Prussia and the South German states were German in language, history, culture, and ethnicity. The main difference between the two was religion. In order to finish off his plan, Bismarck needed to force those South German states to make a decision. What they were, Catholics first and Germans second, or Germans first and Catholics second. To force the issue, Bismarck engineered a war against a Catholic, non-German state. Therefore, the South German states needed to pick a side. Would they side with their German friends, aka Prussia, or with their Catholic co-religionists? Bismarck chose wisely and began a war with France. Although Catholic, it was highly unlikely that the South German states would side with France, however Catholic, against their German Protestants. Bismarck made the right choice. The South German states sided with Prussia, and together they crushed and humiliated the French army, led by the Emperor Napoleon III. As you can see from this image, Napoleon himself was captured in battle and deposed. He would be released, but fled into exile rather than attempting to retake France. The war was a complete German victory, and Bismarck was even able to add some territories to Prussia as an added bonus. The territories he acquired were known as Alsace and Lorraine, and were those areas that Louis XIV had conquered from the Holy Roman Empire centuries earlier. These additions would prove contentious, though, for the next 70 years or so. After the resounding victory of the Franco-Prussian War, the South German states merged with Prussia, leading to the situation you see in the map here. Now only 2 states remain in Central Europe, Austria in the south, and Prussia, soon to be renamed the German Empire, in the north. In fact, to add insult to injury, the King of Prussia, William I, and Bismarck announced the merger and creation of the German Empire in January 1871 in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, when they are finalizing the end of the Franco-Prussian War. What better place to announce German victory and French defeat than the center of Louis XIV's grand throne room? By carefully manipulating those nations around him, and by using short, decisive wars to the best possible effect, Bismarck crafted the German Empire between 1864 and 1871. Prussia's transformation into Germany is one of the best examples of the way in which nationalism could be used to unite several states into a grander kingdom or empire. Prussia's foe to the south, Austria, provides a perfect example of the possible opposite effects of nationalism, when it can tear a multi-ethnic state apart. As I mentioned earlier, Austria is very different from Prussia in a number of ways. One of the most significant of these was the diversity of languages spoken in Austria. This map shows the distribution of 11 different languages spoken in the state. Rather than uniting the state, as in Prussia and even Italy, language divided Austrians from each other. I want to point out at this juncture that German was the most spoken language in Austria, followed closely by Hungarian. Therefore, the largest minority within Austria, and the one that gave the Austrians the most difficulties, were the Hungarians. We will see this play out a number of times in the coming decades. The story of Austria's disintegration can best be told by starting in 1848. You'll recall that in 1848, Louis Philippe was overthrown in France, and that this sparked a series of nationalist uprisings throughout Europe. These uprisings were particularly devastating in Austria, as a number of the nationalities that made up Austria declared their independence from the German rulers. Here is an initial starting map of Austria showing the various provinces. When news first broke of the potential revolutions in 1848, the Italian-speaking provinces in southwest Austria declared their independence. They were followed shortly by the Bohemians in northwestern Austria, and then by the Polish-speaking provinces in north and northeast Austria. The most crippling blow came when the Hungarians rose up against the Austrians. At this point, as the map vividly demonstrates, most of what had been Austria was an open rebellion against the government. Only the German-speaking provinces in the south remained part of the state. The inherent problem with nationalist uprisings then reared its head. After all, what did the various groups in opposition to Austria agree about? The Italians, Bohemians, Poles, and Hungarians all wanted their independence from Austria, but did they agree with each other about anything else? Would they help each other? A Bohemian found himself at odds with an Austrian, but wasn't he equally in opposition to a Hungarian, Italian, or Pole? In the end, this division proved the undoing of the Revolution of 1848. The Austrians were able to gather their forces and separately defeat most of the nationalist insurgents. They reconquered the Italian, Bohemian, and Polish provinces when the rebels refused, or proved unable, to reinforce each other. Only the Hungarians remained in rebellion, and the Austrians couldn't defeat them on their own. Austria was not about to allow the Hungarians to succeed in their secession. Instead, the Austrians swallowed their pride and asked for military assistance from the Russians. While it might seem odd for the Russians to help the Austrians in this situation, it does make sense on second thought. The Russians did not want the example of the Hungarians getting independence to succeed, because that might encourage minority groups within the Russian Empire, such as much of Poland, to attempt to do the same. As a result, the Russians sent an army into Hungary, and the Hungarian uprising was also put down. In the end, the Revolution of 1848 did not have as big an impact on Austria as one might have expected. Each of the nationalities was returned to the Austrian state, although the weakness of Austria was exposed. In the height of the discord, the Austrian Emperor Frederick agreed to step down, and his son Francis Joseph took power. Francis Joseph would end up being one of the longest ruling monarchs. In fact, he was still Emperor of Austria over 60 years later when World War I broke out. 1848 was not the end of Austria's problems by any stretch of the imagination. As we've already seen, in 1866, Prussia humiliated the Austrians in the 7 Weeks' War. The fear in Austria was that this further display of Austrian incompetence would lead to a repeat of 1848. To prevent that from happening, the Compromise of 1867 was worked out that resulted in the creation of the dual monarchy. Essentially, Hungary was granted total autonomy within a new state that would be named Austria-Hungary. Hungary could make all of its own internal domestic decisions, but would be linked to Austrian foreign policy matters and by sharing an emperor with them. Therefore, Emperor Francis Joseph remained emperor over the entire empire and made all foreign policy decisions, but Hungary would be able to set its own internal policies. Who liked and who didn't like the compromise? Clearly, the compromise helped both Austria and Hungary. The Hungarians in particular were granted almost everything that they had wanted back in 1848, except for complete independence. Even this still worked in Hungary's favor, because they could count on Austrian military assistance as needed. Losing control over Hungary certainly hurt Austria's pride, but keeping the Hungarians as part of the state, and being able to rely upon them in military matters, meant that Austria had to worry much less about internal rebellion moving forward. The chief opponent of the dual monarchy were the Slavic peoples of the empire. I will spend much more time discussing the Slavs in a later lecture, but for now, you need to know that the third largest group in the empire were the Slavs. Why were the Hungarians the only ones to be included in this compromise? Why couldn't it be a triple or quadruple monarchy? By leaving the Slavs out, the Austrians made sure that the Slavs remained out of power. The Austrians could even count on the Hungarians to help repress the Slavs in the future, because the Hungarians were now invested in the dual monarchy's future. Here is a map showing the new Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria ruled the German-speaking west and the northern provinces. Hungary was given Hungary itself, as well as some of the Slavic regions in the south. In 1908, Bosnia in the far south was incorporated into the state. The compromise also served to reinvigorate the Austro-Hungarian Empire. After having significantly compromised with Hungarians, the government was determined to keep what power it retained. This was one of the reasons why negotiating with the Slavs in the south was so out of the question. It also meant that if an opportunity presented itself to grow the state and increase Austria's power, they would take it. After having been easily defeated by Germany, the Austrians knew that they could not hope to expand into the north or the west. The only opportunity for expansion for Austria-Hungary would be in the south and the east. This is where the Balkans were located, and they would become the center of Austrian attention for much of the rest of the century. I've already foreshadowed how Austria incorporated Bosnia. Unfortunately, from the Austrian point of view, the Balkans also happened to be the area where Russia hoped to expand. The conflict and collision between Austria and Russia in the Balkans would ultimately prove disastrous to both states, indeed, to all of Europe.